A spacesuit isn't protection. It's a wearable countdown. Pressure, oxygen, temperature, carbon dioxide removal. Every single function your body handles automatically, without a second of conscious thought, has to be done for an astronaut by a machine strapped to their back, continuously, for hours, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest doctor. And if any one of those functions stops, the astronaut doesn't have hours to notice. They have seconds. So let's actually take this suit apart, layer by layer, and understand exactly what it's protecting against, and exactly how thin the margin really is. First, we need to stop thinking of a spacesuit as clothing. It isn't clothing, it's a spacecraft, built for one occupant, and it has to do everything a spacecraft's hull does, just in a form flexible enough to let a human being climb, grip, and work with their hands. Inside NASA's current EVA suit, the one used on the International Space Station, pressure is held at 4.3 psi, pure oxygen. Compare that to the station itself, pressurized to something close to Earth's sea level normal, around 14.7 psi, a mix of oxygen and nitrogen, just like the air in the room you're sitting in. Outside the suit, vacuum, nothing, zero pressure for all practical purposes. That gap, from 4.3 psi down to zero, is the entire reason the suit exists. And it isn't a gentle gap. The human body is not built to tolerate the absence of pressure. At sea level, our blood, our tissue, the fluid around every cell in our body, exists in a state of equilibrium with the atmosphere pressing in on us from outside. Remove that outside pressure entirely, and the body has no way to hold itself together in the way it's used to. This isn't speculation. We know exactly what happens, because it's happened on the ground during a test with rescue seconds away instead of minutes. December 14th, 1966. NASA engineer Jim LeBlanc was inside a vacuum chamber in Houston, testing an early prototype spacesuit that would eventually evolve into the Apollo design. A pressurization hose came loose. In roughly 10 seconds, LeBlanc's suit pressure collapsed from an already thin 3.8 psi down to about 0.1 psi. Functionally, vacuum. Here's the science of what happened to him next, and it's worth understanding precisely because it's almost never explained correctly in fiction. Movies love to show a person exposed to vacuum exploding, or their eyes bulging out, or their body freezing solid instantly. None of that is accurate. Human skin is elastic enough and strong enough to hold the body's shape even against a full pressure differential. You do not explode. What actually happens is a phenomenon called ebulism. Under normal atmospheric pressure, liquids, including the water in your blood, your saliva, the fluid in your tissues, have a boiling point well above body temperature, which is why they stay liquid inside you. But boiling point isn't just about heat. It's about the relationship between temperature and pressure. Drop the pressure low enough, and a liquid can boil at a much lower temperature, including, in a vacuum, at normal human body temperature. That's ebulism, fluids beginning to vaporize, not because anything got hot, but because the pressure holding them in a liquid state simply isn't there anymore. LeBlanc later described exactly this sensation. The last thing he remembered, before losing consciousness, was feeling the saliva on his tongue starting to boil. He was unconscious in about 14 seconds. That number matters. It lines up closely with what aerospace physiologists call the time of useful consciousness at near vacuum exposure, roughly 9 to 15 seconds before the brain, deprived of oxygenated blood pressure, simply stops functioning normally. A technician in the chamber saw what was happening and moved immediately, manually repressurizing the chamber to a breathable level in under 30 seconds. LeBlanc woke up shortly after. He walked away with nothing worse than a mild earache from the rapid pressure change. Sit with that ratio for a second. 14 seconds to unconsciousness. under 2 minutes to death, if pressure isn't restored. That's the outer edge of survivability cited by NASA's own aerospace medicine research. And LeBlanc survived because he had a person standing a few feet away who could fix the problem within that window. In orbit, 400 kilometers up, there is no one standing outside the airlock with their hand on a valve. The suit itself has to be the only thing standing between an astronaut and that same clock running out. So how do you build something that has to win that fight every single time for 6 to 8 hours at a stretch? You build it in layers, 14 of them, on NASA's current EMU suit, and each one is solving a completely different problem. Closest to the skin is the liquid cooling and ventilation garment, a snug, spandex-like undergarment threaded with roughly 100 meters of thin plastic tubing, circulating chilled water directly against the astronaut's body. This is the suit's primary defense against overheating, and it matters more than people expect, because a working astronaut generates a surprising amount of metabolic heat with nowhere for it to go in a vacuum. There's no air outside the suit to carry that heat away by convection the way a fan or breeze would on Earth. Next comes the part that's actually holding the astronaut's life inside the suit, a urethane-coated nylon pressure bladder. This is the layer containing the 4.3 psi of pure oxygen the astronaut breathes and lives inside. On its own, that bladder would simply inflate like a balloon under pressure, which is why it's wrapped immediately by a restraint layer, a tough woven fabric, similar in construction to material used in camping tents, that holds the bladder to the correct shape of a human body instead of letting it billow outward into an immobile sphere. Everything from there outward is the thermal micrometeoroid garment, 7+ alternating layers of aluminized mylar and a spacer fabric called dacron, functioning almost exactly like a thermos. This is the layer fighting the temperature extremes of space directly. On the sunlit side of a spacecraft, surface temperatures can climb past 250 degrees Fahrenheit. In shadow, they can drop past -250. The same suit, on the same spacewalk, sometimes within minutes of moving from sunlight to shade, has to manage both. The outermost layer is a tough woven blend called orthofabric, a combination of Gore-Tex, Kevlar, and Nomex, providing both abrasion resistance and a first line of defense against micrometeoroids and orbital debris. This is worth being precise about. This layer doesn't stop a serious debris impact. Nothing worn by a human body realistically could. What it's engineered for is the far more common threat: the countless tiny particles, smaller than a grain of sand, that are constantly present in low Earth orbit, moving at speeds that can exceed 7 kilometers per second. At that velocity, even something microscopic carries enough kinetic energy to matter. NASA's own risk modeling for the space station's protective systems targets a probability of no lethal penetration exceeding 99.95% per mission for a suited astronaut, a number that sounds reassuring until you remember what the other side of that percentage represents. None of those 14 layers would keep an astronaut alive for more than a few minutes without the primary life support system. The backpack, weighing around 54 kilograms, roughly half the entire suit's mass. This is where the oxygen actually lives, where carbon dioxide gets scrubbed out of the air before it can build to dangerous levels, where the water for that cooling garment gets chilled, and where the suit's radio and battery power are housed. The CO2 problem is one people underestimate. A human body doesn't stop producing carbon dioxide just because it's in a sealed suit. And in an enclosed volume, that small, unscrubbed CO2 can build to dangerous, even lethal concentrations within a surprisingly short window. The PLAS handles this continuously, cycling air through a scrubbing canister for the entire duration of the spacewalk. If that scrubber fails, or its canister saturates, there's no outside air to dilute the problem. The astronaut is breathing their own accumulating exhaust in a sealed volume roughly the size of a phone booth. And because even a 54-kilogram life support backpack can fail, there's a backup. The secondary oxygen pack, a separate emergency reserve, providing roughly 30 minutes of breathing oxygen if the primary system stops working entirely. 30 minutes sounds like a reasonable buffer, until you remember that 30 minutes is meant to be enough time to abandon whatever task is underway and get an incapacitated or endangered astronaut back through an airlock, which, on the space station, is not always 30 seconds away. Here's what makes spacesuit risk genuinely harder to fully engineer around. Pressure loss isn't even the only way this system can turn on the person wearing it. We've covered this before on this channel. In 2013, astronaut Luca Parmitano's helmet began filling with water mid-spacewalk. Not a pressure failure, a cooling system fault that sent water backward into his breathing air loop instead of away from it. Within minutes, it had reached his eyes, his nose, his ears, cutting off his vision and muffling his hearing while he was still tethered to the outside of the space station. That incident is the clearest possible proof that a spacesuit isn't defending against one threat. It's defending against dozens, simultaneously, for hours at a time. Pressure, temperature, oxygen supply, CO2 buildup, water intrusion, radiation, debris, and every one of those systems has to keep functioning without a single unrecoverable failure, because there usually isn't a way to simply take the suit off and try again. There's one more danger in this story that has nothing to do with the suit failing at all. It comes from the suit working exactly as designed. Remember that pressure gap? The station sits around 14.7 psi. The suit operates at 4.3. That's a massive drop. And the human body doesn't handle sudden pressure drops well even when they're intentional and controlled. Under normal station pressure, nitrogen, an inert gas that makes up most of the air we breathe, dissolves into an astronaut's blood and tissue, the same way carbon dioxide dissolves into a sealed bottle of soda under pressure. Drop that pressure quickly, and just like opening the bottle, that dissolved nitrogen wants to come out of solution, as bubbles, inside the bloodstream and joints. This is decompression sickness. Divers call it the bends, and it can cause anything from joint pain to neurological damage to death, depending on severity. This is exactly why astronauts don't just put a suit on and walk outside. Before every spacewalk, they spend hours pre-breathing pure oxygen, sometimes combined with light exercise, specifically to purge dissolved nitrogen from their bloodstream before the pressure drop ever happens. Skip that step, rush it, or get the protocol even slightly wrong, and the suit doesn't need to fail mechanically at all for the pressure differential itself to become the injury. None of what we've just walked through is a design flaw. It's a series of calculated trade-offs, made by people who understood exactly how thin this margin is, and built redundancy into every layer they possibly could, without making the suit too stiff to actually work in. A suit thick enough to eliminate every conceivable risk would be too rigid for an astronaut to bend an elbow, let alone perform delicate repair work outside a space station. So instead, every layer represents a compromise. Just enough thermal protection, just enough micrometeoroid resistance, just enough pressure redundancy, stacked on top of each other until the combined system, statistically, holds almost every single time. And it does hold, almost every single time. Astronauts have logged many thousands of hours outside spacecraft since the 1960s, and the list of suit-related close calls remains mercifully short. That's not luck. That's 14 layers, a backup oxygen supply, a cooling loop, a CO2 scrubber, and hours of pre-breathe protocol, all doing their job correctly, spacewalk after spacewalk. So, death trap? or the most quietly impressive piece of engineering human beings have ever built? I believe both things are true at once, and that's really the point. It's a device that keeps a person alive in an environment that gives the human body, unprotected, somewhere between 14 seconds and 2 minutes before it's over. And it has done that job successfully, again and again, for longer than most of the people watching this have been alive. But every layer in it exists, because someone, somewhere, already found out the hard way what happens when one of those layers isn't there. Jim LeBlanc found the edge of that margin in a lab in 1966 with a technician a few feet away. Every astronaut who has opened a hatch and stepped outside since has trusted that the same margin will hold for them, with help several hundred kilometers straight down, and nothing but engineering standing in between. If you want more of these, subscribe. And if you had to bet on which single system failing would scare you the most, pressure, temperature, oxygen, or water, I'd genuinely like to hear your answer in the comments below.